Okay, good morning, Year 10. So in today's lesson, I wanted to talk you through the food webs and food chains and how to tackle these kind of questions. So before we even attempt this question, we need to know two things. One of them is what is a herbivore, and secondly, what is a carnivore? So all the other terms that are in this, we've already discussed if you've done the sheet that I've set you on ePraise, but we haven't discussed carnivore and herbivore, but we have talked about it in previous lessons. So think about it. What is a carnivore and what is a herbivore? So pause the video here and try to write the two definitions or what you think they are, okay? So 2 minutes from now. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly tell you what these two words are because you do need to know that to access this question. So a herbivore is an organism that feeds on plants, whereas a carnivore feeds on other organisms, so other animals, for example. So this question is asking us to fill in the missing gaps to complete the food web using the table on the left. So here is my food web, and here we've got the table with the information. So before we even look at the table, I already know that every food web or food chain even starts with a plant or generally an organism that can photosynthesize. And remember, photosynthesizing means making glucose using the sun's energy and carbon dioxide and water, of course. And this would be a plant, so plants photosynthesize. So for example, we've got green plants, trees, and algae. And these organisms that are at the very beginning of the food chain or food web are called producers. And if I look at the food web on here, that's the beginning. So I know that this will be the producer. And the arrows here, they tell me which organism will be feeding on this producer. So the organisms would be called the consumer because they are feeding on the plant, they're feeding on the producer. And specifically, the first consumers are called primary. So primary consumers. You can think of it as going to primary school. That's the very first school you go to, and then you go to secondary school, which would bring us to these ones here. So again, these organisms on the second layer of the food web would be called the secondary consumer. And in the third layer here, the consumer that's feeding on this second consumer would be called the tertiary consumer. Right, now that we've got this down, we are going to have a quick look at the table because we are trying to fill in the food web using the organisms that are found in this table. So the weasel is already in there and I want to find the producer. So if I have a look at this table, I can see that oak leaves are photosynthetic. So that means that it's the producer. So I'm going to highlight it in yellow. And in green, I want to highlight all of the organisms on here that are herbivores. So remember, herbivore means that they are feeding on plants. Let's have a look. A fox, their prey includes small mammals. Hedgehog eats earthworms and mollusks. Snails are herbivorous mollusks, so a snail is a herbivore. A vole is a herbivorous mammal, and a weasel is a carnivorous small mammal, and an earthworm is a herbivore. Okay, so I've got now the three organisms that are my primary consumers because they are feeding on plants. So any of these can go in these boxes, but I still don't know in which order they will go in there. So let's work backwards then. So I know we've got the weasel, and let's highlight carnivores in red. So the weasel is already here, and it says that it's a carnivorous small mammal. And at the top it says the fox, the prey includes small mammals. So that could be the tertiary consumer. And then we've got a hedgehog which eats small and mollusks. So from this information, I can already say that the fox will be at the very top of the food chain. So the fox will prey on the weasel and one more organism, which will only leave us with the hedgehog, because that's the only other carnivore on here. And of course, now looking at it, I forgot to include the oak leaves. So now the question is, how do we order the last three primary consumers? So let's have a look. We know that the hedgehog eats earthworms and mollusks. So the two organisms that it's feeding on here need to be earthworm and a mollusk. So let's write earthworm. So we've got that one, and a mollusk. So we know a snail is a herbivorous mollusk, so this would be a snail. And the last one will therefore be the last one that's missing, which is a vole. Lovely. So now we've got the food chain ready and completed. So let's have a look at this question, and this is your turn now. Feeding relationships can be shown using food chains. The figure below shows a food chain for organisms in a habitat. We've got a leaf that's eaten by a beetle. The beetle is eaten by a mouse, and the mouse is eaten by the owl. So which one of these is the producer in the food chain? Well, this is up to you. Remember what we said up here, what is a producer, and you can again look back on your notes from the PDF file that I've posted on ePraise. So I'm going to give you a few seconds for this actually. Let's make it 10 seconds. Okay, so the producer here, hopefully you got it right, is the leaf, because producers are either plants or trees, algae, or any other organisms that can photosynthesize. So again, this question is using the same food chain of a leaf, beetle, mouse, and owl, but the question's asking, name the primary consumer in the food chain. So what do we mean by that? Remember, primary, just like primary school, what does that mean? And what is a consumer? And that's going to help you figure out the answer to this question. Okay, so the primary consumer is the first organism that feeds on the producer, so the leaf. So this is the producer, so therefore the primary consumer will be the beetle. Now we have it. Okay, so try and have a go at the question that I've put on ePraise. Right, so on your PDF that I've uploaded on ePraise, there's a question like this, which is saying, study the relationship of a variety of living organisms found in the garden. So we've got cats, small spiders, ladybirds, cabbages, and so on. And this is showing us a food chain. And this one might be looking a little bit more complicated than the one that we've seen up here, right? Because it's got more organisms. If we have a proper look at it, it's actually not that hard. So the first thing I would do is have a look at the producers. So the very, very first organism in a food chain or the food web that herbivores feed on. So I can see that cabbages are a plant, and the caterpillars and aphids are feeding on it. And then we've got a tomato plant, and that's it. Yeah, so these are the two plants that I've got here, which are my producers. And the primary consumers, I can see that are herbivores, are cabbage caterpillars, aphids, and earwigs. So these are the organisms that are feeding off plants and are therefore herbivores, and are therefore the primary consumers. And the other organisms will therefore be carnivores because they are feeding on other animals. So we've got wasp larvae, ladybirds, and large spiders, which would be the secondary consumer. Let's see a slightly different one. We've got a small spider and a sparrow, which are feeding on these red organisms here. These would be my tertiary, these would be my tertiary consumers. And at the very top here, we've got the cats, so the top of the food chain. So this is just trying to make sense of the food web that we're looking at. And so question 1A is asking, if all cabbages were destroyed by a pathogen, which animal's food supply would disappear completely? So let's have a look. And I can see that I've got cabbages right here, which is my producer. So let's say that this completely disappeared. So which animal's food supply will therefore completely disappear? So I know that cabbage caterpillars, they only feed on cabbages. So if cabbages are gone, the cabbage caterpillar won't have any food. So the cabbage caterpillar will go completely. And I can see that the aphid is also feeding on cabbages. However, it's also feeding on the tomato plant. So even though it might not have any cabbages, it will still have this source of food, so the tomato plant. So the aphid will be fine, but the cabbage caterpillar won't, because he only feeds on cabbages. Okay, so that would answer the first question for you. And if the cabbage, question 1B is now asking, if the cabbages were destroyed, which organism's food supply would reduce and why? So which organism will therefore, which organism's food supply will reduce? So I'm going to have a look at which animal or organism is feeding off of the cabbage caterpillar, and I can see that it's the wasp larva, but the wasp larva also feeds on the aphid. But since it's not going to have the cabbage caterpillar, the food supply might reduce. So have a go at the rest of the questions now. So if the ladybird numbers increased, which animals would also increase and why? So again, have a look at where the ladybird is and have a look at what it's eating and which other organisms are feeding on it. Okay, so hopefully that helped you out a little bit to answer these questions. If you have any more questions, please feel free to message me on ePraise and I will answer your questions as soon as I can. Okay, have a nice rest of your day and I speak to you soon. Bye.